As we talk about, Palm Sunday, we do associate that so much with spring and, of course, with new life, because that's the thing we really kind of celebrate in the Easter season, is that things kind of come back and it's a real chance, I think, that if we stop and just take a minute to think about what Easter really means and what happened 2,000 years ago, that it's a chance to really embrace the fact that Jesus gave us a path to new life. So what I'd like to do today is basically walk through the events of Palm Sunday as the various Gospels tell us about, as the various Gospels give us the eyewitness accounts of what went on there. And what I'd also hope that we might do as we go through this, to reflect over the past few weeks, that my goal over these past 3 weeks has really been to kind of put on our minds what Jesus has called us to do, and that if we have put our faith in Jesus, and if we embrace the resurrection, if that's something we've put our faith in, that it propels us to do something. It takes away the things that keep us from doing things. If we will truly embrace what that means, amazing things become possible. So as we kind of go through this narrative today, my hope is that we would think about those things that become possible. So as we look at things that happened 2,000 years ago, I think that if we are willing to look at the narratives, not just as a narrative, but embracing the fact that these were real people with real experiences, there begins to be something there that we can kind of apply to our own lives. That one of the things I think that's a challenge is, like, when I was a kid on Easter Sunday and Palm Sunday and those sort of things, there was always kind of the story of Jesus. And you kind of hear it so much, sometimes you forget the impact of it. But as I've gotten older, I start to look at all of these things as stories of people. Stories of people that Jesus stepped into their lives. And as I start to look at these as stories of people, it stops being this distant idea of something that Jesus did, and starts becoming something that Jesus empowers people to do. And that's my hope, that what we'll see as we go through this. So, if you've been around church for any length of time, you have certainly heard this story many, many times by now. But my hope is that we might be able to hear it with just something new. So we'll start out with what Matthew tells us about the day we call Palm Sunday. Now, Matthew was someone who followed Jesus. He knew Jesus personally. As many of you know, he was a tax collector, so he's probably very literate, very smart. And so he documented some things for us. And he tells us as Jesus rides into town on the Sunday we call Palm Sunday, he says, most of the crowd spread their garments on the road ahead of him, and others cut branches from trees and spread them on the road. Jesus was in the center of the procession. The people all around him were shouting, "Praise God for the Son of David. Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Praise God in highest heaven." The entire city of Jerusalem was in an uproar as he entered. "Who is this?" they asked. And the crowd replied, "It's Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." So as Jesus comes riding in, they're doing something kind of strange. We call it Palm Sunday because that kind of paints a pretty picture of palm leaves, right? But what we know is that they were throwing branches down onto the ground. Palms are a reasonable assumption about that, given the climate they were in. But the main thing they were throwing down were basically clothing. Why were people throwing clothing at Jesus? Well, because they saw him as the king, right? And there was just kind of this tradition, this kind of trying to edify, right? That if he's truly royalty, we don't want his feet to even touch the ground. But in his case, he's riding in on a donkey. But again, they're saying that we consider you so high that even the animal that you ride in, its feet, shouldn't touch the ground. But why were they so worked up? Why were they so excited about Jesus coming in? Why did they believe in this moment that he was king? And the reasons actually go back about 500 years before Jesus, that in one of the last books of what we call the Old Testament, the book of Zechariah, which was written roughly 500 years before Jesus, Zechariah said that in the future, a righteous and victorious king will come. And that king will come to free them. And he will be humble. And he will be riding on a donkey. So the people in that moment said, this Jesus guy, we're hearing about this stuff he's doing. He's working miracles. Yet he's humble. And he's powerful, but he doesn't act like it. And here he is riding on a donkey. And we've been subjugated to countries for centuries. We're currently under the rule of Rome, but they've been under the rule of other countries, again, going back centuries. In effect, they're conquered by somebody, they're under the rule of that country. That country gets conquered, Israel didn't become free. They were just ruled by that other country instead. And so they had been waiting for hundreds of years to finally be free. And that king who is going to set us free has finally come. That's why they were so excited and so worked up. But if you know this story, you know that attitude doesn't hold very long. Within days, a whole attitude would shift. Within 5 days or so, they'd be shouting to have him killed. And we know that by Thursday, so about 4 days after Palm Sunday, Jesus would be having dinner with his disciples. He would say that one of them is about to betray him. When they finished dinner, Jesus and a few of his disciples would head out to a garden area to pray. And while they were there, one of Jesus' close friends, Judas, betrays him. So within hours of when Jesus said that would happen. And Judas brings Roman soldiers with him, along with some others, to arrest Jesus. Now, as I've said, that most of us have heard this story over and over again over the years. But let's just take a minute and try to imagine that if I'm telling this story right now, you had never heard this story before. And so I described the situation of Jesus arriving to great fanfare and everything people were putting on him, everything that people were believing about him, and how they cheered for him. If I tell you that 4 days later, Judas shows up with some soldiers to try to arrest Jesus, you might be tempted to think, well, Jesus is going to be fine. I mean, the whole city is on his side. Right? If they try to arrest him, if they try to convict him, the whole city is going to rise up into a riot. They're not going to let this happen. That's what we might be tempted to think. But you probably have heard this story before. And you know that's not what happens. You know that as Jesus gets arrested, he is first put on trial in front of the religious leadership. And it's a sham. They have already decided he's guilty. They're simply trying to put together a reason to call him guilty. They do that. They then turn him over to a Roman governor, Pilate. And there's only one reason they involve Pilate. The only organization with the authority to execute people was Rome. So they couldn't kill him himself. So they had no choice but engage Rome. So they turn him over to Pilate. And Pilate starts talking to Jesus. And as Pilate hears what Jesus has to say, Pilate's not necessarily buying what Jesus is saying, but it's clear to him that the guy's done nothing wrong. That the only reason Jesus is here is that the religious leadership is jealous. That they have built their power on this kind of very restrictive, loaded down idea of a scary God trying to hold people down. And Jesus is out here preaching this thing about relationship with God is personal. And you don't need anybody in the middle. That the only thing you'll need in the middle is Jesus. And from there, your relationship is entirely personal. So Pilate basically says, this guy has done nothing wrong. And he actually offers to release Jesus. But as he does that, Luke tells us, but the mob shouted louder and louder, demanding that Jesus be crucified. And their voices prevailed. Now again, what's funny is that based on the behavior on Sunday, of the crowd's behavior on Sunday, the thought would have been that if they tried to convict Jesus, you would get a riot by trying to convict Jesus. But here we are, Friday morning, 5 days later. The opposite's happening. Pilate looks at the crowd and realizes that unless I convict this guy, I'm going to have a riot. And keep in mind that the way you kept Rome happy as governor is Rome just didn't want to hear about any trouble. So Pilate's job is to make sure nothing gets so bad that it gets back to Rome. And if you have to kill somebody to do it, you do it. It's what it takes to run a city. It's not easy. Somebody's got to do it, right? So basically, Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as the people demanded. So Jesus is taken to the cross and he's crucified. Crucifixion, a long, painful death that if you're lucky, takes hours, commonly takes days. So, what happened? I mean, what happened? How did people go from cheering for the king that's going to rescue us on Sunday to saying that we want this guy to die the worst way humanity has come up with to kill a person in 5 days? How does that happen? Well, I think we get some insights during Jesus' time on the cross. Now, as Jesus is executed, we know he's not executed alone, that there are two other men with him that we commonly call criminals. The Greek word that's actually translated commonly as criminal actually is better translated as like highwayman. In other words, a land pirate. So these guys were likely people who made their living waiting on the remote roads outside of cities, jumping travelers, which means that they would have stolen from people, left people to die, possibly killed people. So these are the guys that are there. And as the three of them are on the cross, we're told, one of the criminals hanging beside Jesus scoffed. So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself. And us too, while you're at it. Now this guy appears to be a very harsh criminal, very hard criminal. So him saying things like that might be what you expect from someone like that. But he wasn't the only one saying those things. We know that very similar comments were coming from the crowds, were coming from the religious leadership, because Luke tells us that the crowd watched and the leaders scoffed. He saved others, they said. Let him save himself if he really is God's Messiah, if he really is the chosen one. So, from the criminal, you're the Messiah? Prove it. All the way to the people in the crowd. If you were really the Messiah, you'd be doing things this way, or you'd be doing things that way. And I think what we see happening is that for all of these people, from the criminal to the righteous to the self-righteous, in their own minds, they had decided what a Messiah would do. That in their own minds, they had decided that if you're with God, well, God wouldn't have done things like this. God would have done things differently. If Jesus was truly from God, he'd behave the way they think he should behave. And since Jesus isn't doing the sort of things they expect, he couldn't possibly be from God. That these people had all these preconceived notions of what the Messiah would do. They had these preconceived notions about how God was supposed to do what they wanted him to do. And, to be fair, not quite being clear about how God thinks is pretty understandable. I think we all have some confusion at times. But if we were to dig around a bit more, and if we were to actually spend time kind of reading through the Gospels, reading through these accounts, what we find out is that there's some common themes to the ideas and expectations that are going on with people. Most of the ideas that people had about what God would do were things that God would do that would benefit them personally, what they would get out of the deal with God. And since as they looked at what Jesus was doing, and there was no straight line that they could draw between his actions and how they would benefit, then he couldn't possibly be from God. Because they were so focused on preconceived ideas, they completely missed what God was doing directly in their midst. And although we don't know for sure, if we look at Judas, the person who turned Jesus in, we don't know exactly what his motivations are, but it seems his motivations are based on preconceived ideas of what Jesus should be doing. All right? I mean, Judas has been one of Jesus' closest followers. And remember that the expectation that had developed based on that prophecy of 500 years ago was that this Messiah would show up one day and basically rip his robe open with a giant Superman M going, "Messiah!" And he would fly in and he would save everybody. And he did, but not like they expected. No, what's going to happen, right, is that he's going to conquer Rome. He's going to crush Rome. And we'll finally get to step on people with our boot now. That's what everyone expected. And Judas is thinking that, man, when this dude rises to the top, I'm one of the closest. I'm going to get this sweet elite spot. And all of a sudden, Jesus is talking about humility and giving away things and doing for others more than you do for yourself. And he's like, wait a minute. When do I get mine? And basically he decides that he's never going to get mine through Jesus. So I'll get mine off the back of Jesus. I will turn him in for a reward. So across the board, preconceived ideas of what God should be doing, how this was all supposed to work, or what caused people to miss what was going on. The people were so focused on the little things they expected that they missed the massive thing that God was doing right in their midst. But preconceived ideas were not the only reason the people missed what Jesus was doing. The Apostle Peter gives us another example of how people missed what Jesus was doing. Remember that Peter had been one of Jesus' very first followers. Kind of that first day that he's calling followers. Peter was there. And Peter told Jesus over and over again that I am with you to the end. There is nothing that can happen that could push me away from you. I'll never leave you no matter what happens. And Peter is with Jesus when he's arrested. And although as the soldiers come in, Peter, like the others, did run away, it does appear that initially Peter tried to stay with Jesus even after the arrest. Because Luke tells us that they arrested Jesus and led him to the high priest's home. And Peter followed at a distance. The guards lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat around it. And Peter joined them there. A servant girl noticed Peter in the firelight and began staring at him. Finally, she said, "This man is a Jesus follower." And Peter denied it. "Woman," he said, "I don't even know him." So he denies that he knows Jesus. And it happens again, and it happens again. He said he would always be there for Jesus. But as this happens to his friend, his dear friend, Jesus, it's all too much. So Peter finally runs away, abandoning his friend. That rather than being there as all this goes on, he runs away. Why does he run away? It's fear. It's fear. He's afraid. He was too afraid to stick it out. And before we come down too hard on Peter about that, everyone else was too afraid too, right? Those who had not turned against Jesus because he wasn't meeting expectations had run away because they were afraid. Almost all of his followers, almost all of his friends ran away. So all of these people who had been in the presence of Jesus, some of these people knew him well. Some of these people barely knew him at all. And as Jesus is about to undertake what is the greatest event in human history, something that would impact all of humanity, but at the same time be incredibly individual and incredibly personal. They had all started out there, and they all missed it. Some because of preconceived ideas. I think God should do it this way, and he's not doing it that way. Or I think I should get something better out of this deal, and that's not happening. Others because of fear. The situation, they just couldn't pull the courage together to stick it out. God was doing something miraculous, and they missed it. Now, as I grew up and I would hear this narrative, I had always been under the impression that everyone had missed it. But it turns out that everyone didn't miss it. We know of at least two people who had tapped in that something special was going on. Now, one of those people was a woman named Mary, which is a really confusing name because there's like 20 Marys in the New Testament. But this is Mary, sister of Martha, also sister of Lazarus. And we see that Mary, prior to Palm Sunday, before Jesus ever begins the ride into the city, Mary sees that something is going on. Because John tells us that before Jesus begins his ride, Mary does something that seems kind of strange. We're told Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from essence of nard. She anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. The house was filled with fragrance. So, as she does this, John goes on to tell us that Judas is upset by this. He's like, hey, that stuff's expensive. What are you doing? We could make some cash off of that. What are you doing? But as Judas does that, Jesus steps in. Jesus replied, leave her alone. She did this in preparation for my burial. In other words, Mary understood that something was about to happen. Jesus was about to be executed, and she seemed to be tapped in that was going on. So, how does Mary see what all these other people miss? People who were actually much closer to Jesus than Mary was. Well, I think if we kind of follow the path, we see it. I mean, first of all, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were all good friends of Jesus. As we read through the gospel narratives, we know that Jesus often visited with them. He often stayed there, and they were close friends. And whenever Jesus was staying with them, Jesus would do what Jesus does. He would start teaching. Whoever was there, he would start teaching to. And whenever he was teaching, Mary would go listen to his teaching. In fact, Mary is in one of the more famous gospel stories, the story of Mary and Martha. Right? In the story of Mary and Martha, Jesus is there teaching. Martha decides she's going to create this great big dinner that Jesus never asked her to do. And Mary decides she wants to listen to Jesus rather than be kind of busy in the kitchen because I can cook any day. But Jesus isn't here every day. And Martha gets upset with Mary and decides the thing to do is complain to Jesus. So Martha goes to Jesus and says, my sister Mary's listening to you teach, but she should be in the kitchen helping me. And Jesus says, no. Mary's doing what's important here. Mary taking the time to listen, the time to learn. And because of that, for Mary, rather than being caught up in preconceived ideas of what the Messiah should be doing, what God should be doing, she had been listening. And Jesus commonly taught and commonly said that I will need to go to die. But people weren't listening. But Mary was. So as so many people missed what Jesus was doing, Mary didn't only miss it, she actually stepped into it. She actually got in step with Jesus. She got in step with what God was doing. And it turns out that Mary is not the only person who understood that something was happening. She wasn't the only person who understood that Jesus was doing something special. The other person we know who saw he was doing something special occurs on the day of the crucifixion, as Jesus is on the cross. Remember that there are two criminals who are executed along with Jesus. We know the first criminal was actually giving Jesus a hard time. That if you're really the Messiah, you should be doing this. But the other criminal had a different attitude. And as the first criminal demands that Jesus prove himself, Luke tells us that the other criminal protested. Don't you fear God, even when you've been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes. But this man hasn't done anything wrong. Then he said to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replied, I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise. This man saw what Jesus was really doing. This man, although he knew his life was ending, he saw that Jesus was doing something so much bigger than just this life. And he wanted to be a part of it. But he knew he couldn't do it on his own. He understands that he has to ask Jesus for help. And he had the humility to do that. So in doing that, he also became a part of what Jesus is doing. They actually became a part of this narrative. Mary, as it begins, and the criminal, as it ends. Their willingness to put aside the things that other people could not put aside. Mary's willingness to put aside the idea of preconceived ideas. Their willingness to put aside fears. And instead, listen to Jesus' teaching. Embrace humility. Enable them to see what Jesus was doing. But here's the thing. They weren't just witnesses to what Jesus was doing. They weren't just consumers. They weren't just spectators. They were actually an active part of Jesus' redemptive plan for humanity. They were an active part of it. And so the thing that I hope that all of us will embrace as we look ahead at Holy Week, as we get to Easter, as we reflect on the things that we've talked about these past few weeks, that exact invitation is what is offered to us, that we are invited to be an active part of Jesus' redemptive plan for humanity, to actually step into it, to not be spectators, to not be consumers, but to be people who are stepping out there and engaging with the people around us and putting aside preconceived ideas of how things are supposed to work, on how we always did things, but saying, what do we need to do right now as the world is right now? And putting aside fear of what might happen and what it might cost us and what we might lose. And recognizing that in order to do these things, we've got to embrace the power of Jesus in our lives. And we need to have the humility to take steps that even when they're hard, and even if we don't feel like we can do it, we're going to try anyway. That is the invitation that is laid out for us because of Easter. That is what we are empowered to do. As we put our faith in Jesus, as Andy Stanley said last week, when you no longer fear death, nothing can stop you. And Jesus conquered death. There's nothing to fear. He's doing something so much bigger than what we can hold on to in this life. And we get to be an active part of it by stepping out and embracing the opportunity in front of us. So this Easter week, just embrace that truth of what we can be a part of.